Well, welcome to another episode of Contra Mundum. I'm here, of course, with co-host Andrew Isker, and we're excited to be talking with Lafayette Lee for part 2 of our New Deal and post-New Deal discussion. As you can see today, I have a very ugly background. I'm in my office. I have no professional camera and no professional mic. And of course, Andrew made me lead off the conversation. So you get what you pay for on this podcast. So Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Great week. A lot of interesting stuff has happened. We've had a lot of interesting discourse on the former Twitter.com and online regarding Christian nationalism and blasphemy laws and Francisco Franco and all those things.
I want to say something. So it's actually funny because I've said so many times on the show, like, just dispositionally, I've always just thought of myself as a right-wing reactionary, traditionalist, like the Christian nationalism. I love Stephen's book, but like I was never like intent on just like adopting that and making that my thing. And like
that's me.
But the hysteria on the center and on the conservative movement against it has just like it's kind of forced me into that position where it's fun. It's fun to like adopt the label and play the game because they're so mindless about everything. They have no conception of history. They have no conception about the problems and the dynamics of power in political society and political theology over time. And so you're kind of forced into the situation where you're defending, the opposite stance, the historically dominant stance so often that you might as well just, kind of fit yourself under that umbrella. So it's just funny the way it all shakes out. But I was just thinking to myself on the way over to my office today, I see myself dispositionally in many ways as much more comfortable with like de Maistre and Edmund Burke and some of the counter-revolutionaries in the 18th and 19th century, more than even like the Puritans and stuff. So I'm on the reactionary traditionalist right. Like that's just who I am. But they're just making such memes and caricatures of themselves that I might as well just play the game with them because they're ridiculous.
I know. I don't even. I mean, and it's hard because like I would much rather have, interlocutors who know what they're talking about, and maybe they disagree with you. That's fine. Like people are going to disagree. That's life. But they don't know what they're talking about.
The other thing too is maybe they don't know what they're talking about because I didn't know what I was talking about 7 years ago, right? This is a process. Yeah. We're rediscovering things for the first time in the American context. That's what the whole ressourcement has been about. But if you don't know something, you don't need to sit there and pontificate about it, and pretend like this is sort of the problem, the flaw of like Whiggish history, like year current is all we need to know about anything. And we don't even need to investigate or rethink at all. And that's, I think, the more serious problem is there's not even willing to question themselves, to stand outside of liberal democracy and critique it from other perspectives, more traditional and historically honest, perspectives.
Yes. And I mean, and to that end, I can segue into our guest here, Lafayette Lee, who is back on the show. I said we had to, I think on Twitter, I said we had to get up to 500 subscribers or he wouldn't come back. And so we did that successfully just yesterday. So he's back here for round 2 to continue the discussion from last week. And, we got into the New Deal and we got into, the history of the New Deal, both the regime narrative of what the New Deal is and what it actually was, this revolutionary period in American history, American politics. And so welcome back to the show, Lafayette. We're going to talk now this week about communist subversion in America from the 30s through the 50s. And so why don't we go right off the bat? Just how right was Joe McCarthy, Lafayette?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I did write about this in IM 1776. I make the case that Joe McCarthy was he was self-interested, like all politicians. So always remember that when you go through the McCarthy case, right?
Yeah.
But on top of that, McCarthy he could be self-interested. He could be excessive. He was bombastic. He very fairly is characterized often as a demagogue. All those things might be true, but Joe McCarthy was right about the problem of communist subversion that had come before, especially in the period during the war. And what many fail to understand about him or appreciate about him is that he was also correct in the security situation of the United States at the time, in which the United States did have a serious security problem, in which they were not able to address security problems within the administrative state, meaning whether that was card carrying communists or people who could not pass the background check that they had at the time, which was very poorly devised, to be honest. There was a security risk. And Joe McCarthy, that was his biggest contention with the Truman administration and then after with the Eisenhower administration. It was not just hunting for communists in our ranks. It was also identifying the problem itself is that the administrative state was not adequately they were not adequately weighing the security risks of having infiltrators and subversives and other people in there. And so he was addressing that problem. And unfortunately, he's been used to kind of smear and tarnish the entire anti-communist movement, which, went on for almost a whole century. And so he's a very important person, I think, for people on the right to become acquainted with, because they'll quickly find that while there's always some truth to some of the allegations and the way that he's characterized, most of it is quite unfair, especially when you put it up against the backdrop of the time period in which he lived and the other players that he was contending with at the time.
Yeah, I think, it's, in my history that I was given in public school, it was exactly as you describe, that he is this demagogic guy. He would give these speeches, and he was hunting under communists under every rock, and all of it was just this big boogeyman, and it didn't really exist. That was always the subtext in the regime narrative, is that there really wasn't any communist subversion in the United States. So explain. We got into it a little bit last week. We kind of ran out of time, and so if we have to backtrack a little bit, that's okay. But explain a little bit more about the degree to which there was communist subversion in the Roosevelt and later Truman administration, and not just in political office, but also all throughout the country, in the universities, in the nascent mass media. Hollywood was rife with it. That's the thing that gets lumped in with McCarthy is HUAC and the lists of communist card carrying communists that got blackballed from Hollywood. All of those things play a role in this period, and it's treated like it's a witch hunt. Like these are just people that are like Democrats, only a little bit further left, and they're being persecuted for their politics. And isn't that so horrible and evil? That's the court narrative of it. But is that true?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really good place for people that are trying to make sense of the present. I think that the so-called Red Scare is very instructive. And let's backtrack just for a second and go to what preceded the Red Scare, because it's important to be able to basically get the landscape down, because the Red Scare, the quote unquote Red Scare that came after the war, that really picked up and probably hit its apex 1954, which would be the year that Joe McCarthy was censured. This all came on the heels of a Brown Scare. Okay. And the Brown Scare was very much the creation of media propaganda through the Roosevelt administration, forces that were aligned to get us, to push us into the war. So that would be like industrialists, financiers, Roosevelt's administrators. These are all people in politics, and it was very popular too. Like even down in the region in the South, the war was very popular. The idea of mobilizing for war against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany was more popular in certain pockets of America for various reasons. It's very complex, but essentially America was in this strange point in which prior to Pearl Harbor, most Americans on the aggregate were not supportive of going into the war. Obviously, as we discussed last time, FDR was pushing that very hard. And then there were other, you have different factions and different groups of people culturally, like I mentioned, Southerners. There's going to be people that were more open to this, that felt more sympathetic to England at the time. I mean, so it's very complex, but essentially America was not ready for war culturally, right?
Mm-hmm.
But FDR ramps up his war mobilization. Now, in the process of doing this, and I mentioned these guys last time, you have the rise of the America First Committee, which has been slandered and smeared quite a lot in recent years. But if you actually dig into like John T. Flynn and some of the other movers and shakers within that movement, it was it was characteristically an apolitical movement. I mean, it pulled in people that were conservatives, liberals, progressives. It even had Marxists in its ranks. These were people that were fundamentally opposed to going into war. Many veterans from the First World War were involved in this. And it's a good vignette to kind of paint how the Brown Scare picked up, because during the 1930s, you have the rise of fascism. You have the rise of fascism in the 20s in Italy. Then later on, you have the National Socialists in Germany. And the United States is not very friendly culturally. They're not very friendly to communists, but they're also not friendly to fascists and Nazis. This is just, so you even have people that are on the left that declare themselves as anti-fascist, but you also have like the American Legion that is very hostile to anyone purporting that ideology in the United States. So there's a cultural, muscular backlash to fascists in the United States. This gets overlooked a lot. But there really was never, and I say this over and over, there has never been and never really will be a endemic fascist movement that's truly like American. There's not a fascist tradition in the United States at all. I would argue communism actually has more of like a root in the United States, in the way in which there's a reason why it was a little bit more, there were a lot more Americans that kind of turned their eyes to communism, because it was more of a natural outgrowth. It wasn't necessarily of a foreign import, but fascism was more like that. Mm-hmm. And I know I'll get some pushback for that, but I can back that up.
Yeah, let me. I'm not going to necessarily push back too hard, because I think I probably agree with you. Because there were labor movements in America that weren't. I mean, largely on the right, we kind of assume that the labor movements in America were entirely a creation of Ellis Island immigrants and agitators, anarchists, communists, things like that. But that wasn't necessarily the case, right? It was
right.
There were. I mean, you can even go back to these sort of populist revolts all the way back to the beginning of the American Republic, like Shays' Rebellion and things like that. Where, I mean, I don't know if it would be right to characterize those as like labor revolts, but they're kind of still within that milieu, where it's this populist movement reacting to things that the government or the elites have done, and how they've gotten economically taken advantage of. And so would you categorize it that way, or how how would you look at it?
No, I think that's a good way to bring that up, because the 19th century is very much defined by this contest between labor and capital, right? And I mean, really, like the old Democrat Party, this was, they were really like the bastions of labor. And so you have this natural populist fervor on the Democrat side, on the political spectrum, all throughout the 19th century into the 20th, right? Mm-hmm. Now, communism is not the same thing, and I know that you're drawing that distinction. You have really like the first communists come to America around the time of the war between the states, and you have German. It's these people of German extraction come, and there are these small communities of people that are Marxists, and this is an important cultural point to bring up here, is Americans they've been slow to understand the changes that are happening abroad. They're not quick to recognize them as they kind of take root in the United States. The United States is really, in many ways, a very unique case. Culturally, it's unique. So when you have these, you have something like Marxism, which it just, for many Americans, it wouldn't have been perceived necessarily as a threat, just very strange. And Americans had their own traditional boundaries and barriers and cultures and norms that that they would have felt very safe even with something like that. They couldn't understand, I think, even at the time, what a significant thing, like how significant that this ideology would become later. And so you have this long, you have this really long genealogy that really stretches back to the 19th century, even the United States, of people that at least adhere to some, the Marxist view of history, budding field of economics, and so on. And so,
Mhm.
but labor is still there, as you brought up. And so you have in the United States, you have labor is represented by various political movements, but especially the Democrat Party. And then you have these populist movements that come, that really they rise at, you have somebody like William Jennings Bryan,
Mhm.
really kind of the high point of that populist alliance between farmers, bimetallists,
Mhm.
between even socialists, Christian progressives, and it rises and it finally breaks on the rocks. And this is where, from the remnants of this is where you start to see where communists make a lot of gain. And like I mentioned last time when we spoke, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia really changed. It was a sea change in the culture of the left. Because if you look at the way that those who, not all Democrats are leftists. There isn't quite that same distinction in the United States at the time. But where you see communists and socialists really start to gain a lot of ground, I think the left right distinction starts to make a lot more sense. And this is where you have a sea change in that culture on the left. And so, yes, like you brought up, there has been a long history of labor in the United States. It's a huge contest between labor and capital. How to resolve that tension is really central to so much of our politics in the latter half of the 19th century. And then from there, you start to see communists and socialists making inroads with these different labor groups. And then there's a lot of conflict that starts to erupt as you start to see that these people that you consider your allies, that are working towards, trying to fight for better wages or whatever, that there's also ulterior motives. It's not just to fight for these united goals that we all have. It's to take over the labor organization. It's to subvert the labor organization. It's to kick out the original leadership. And without going too much into that, there were many cases in which you had strikes and violence that was sparked by communists, and that violence really hurt the labor movement. And so you had labor leaders that would call themselves socialist, but they would not call themselves communists.
Yeah.
And they felt very hostile to communism. And there was a lot of infighting that went on in the beginning and then aftermath of the first quote unquote Red Scare. And what that was and why that's important, because it sets us up for a Brown Scare, is that after the Bolshevik Revolution, these communists, self-styled communists in the United States, many of them are immigrants, but there are Americans that are, that come from a more your waspy background that still they are able to get inroads in with high society, because they're kind of emissaries from this embittered, embattled group of communists in the United States that's stretched out from one shore to the other, right?
Yeah.
They're involved in the labor movement, and there's strikes and there's violence breaking out. And what ends up happening is, after the Bolshevik Revolution, essentially, communists follow Lenin's dictum to spread worldwide revolution, and they declare a war on the American U.S. government and on capitalism. It's within the party platform at the time, and there are competing communist parties at the time, but there is a central communist party that eventually becomes the CPUSA. And really, like, this gets denied on the left over and over again, but it's just explicit, is that the goal was to a violent overthrow of capitalism and of the U.S. government. That was from the get-go. That was what the object was. And by seeing Russia succeed, everyone thought that Germany would fall next. It was American communists were emboldened by this and wanted to see the United States become a communist country, which is so far-fetched and ridiculous to think today. But people really wanted that, believe that. And so there was a widespread rash of violence. The attorney general's house was firebombed, and a lot of bombings, a lot of assassination attempts. And what ended up happening is you have the rise of that attorney general, Palmer, and then you have J. Edgar Hoover. they basically came together and they just did a clean sweep of American communists in the United States. And they threw they basically went through, and if you seemed like a communist, you got thrown into these holding pens. And then they deported hundreds of communist agitators, including Emma Goldman, and kicked them out of the United States. I mean, and why this is important is because this is where communists were kind of seen as strange, and people didn't really know what to make of them at the time, even on the left, right? And then you had tension between communist agitators and between, true blue socialists. But you start after the severe, heavy-handed backlash against communists by, the Palmer raids and by Hoover, then you start to see that the sympathy of the left is peaked, and they start to worry about these communists and see that these communists are being treated unfairly, they're being manhandled by the state. And over, there were cases where the state did not produce the goods. They weren't able to verify that so-and-so is a communist, that, they just started scooping up people and violating their rights is what, their critics would say. And so this really hurt the anti-communist movement in the United States, because what it did is it galvanized communists in the eyes of progressives. And so many key leaders, progressives in the progressive movement, they came together, pooled resources, and they fought a lot of legal battles to protect these communists. And what it did is, culturally on the left, not only was the left kind of imbued with this revolutionary fervor at the time, but they also viewed anti-communism as a conspiracy. That really what it was is that anti-communists and conservatives, that they were using communists and their attacks on communists to really strip the rights and civil rights and liberties of regular Americans, to try to curtail the power of the left as much as possible. And so this ongoing conspiracy theory, after the Palmer raids and after the backlash of the Palmer raids, it really pervades throughout the 20th century. And it really hits its high point in the McCarthy era, because for years, decades, many people on the left, prominent liberals, people that I wouldn't say were necessarily were not consciously sympathetic to communism, but they believed that anti-communism was a conspiracy against the left, that it was completely unfounded, that it was sloppy, it was heavy-handed, it was just a thinly veiled attempt to consolidate as much power in the hands of capital or of conservatives, traditionalists as possible. And this cloud hangs over anti-communism for decades. And so I know that that's a lot of history.
No. No.
To get, oh yeah, go ahead. Stop me.
Oh, no. Go ahead. CJ, do you have something you wanted to bring up?
Well, I just wanted to know, like, the way that I think about these things is, to what extent, or I guess the better way of framing it is, when in history did that communist left sort of dissipate and transition into a new left? I know the 60s are sort of the general spot for that, but when did the intelligence agencies, stop worrying about the communist threat? Did they ever take on some of those characteristics? Where the intelligence agencies ever filled themselves with, agents of, the Marxist revolutionary thinking?
That's a great question. It's a tough question too, because some of these things are really hard to. I mean, we're talking about an effect. I'll put it this way: is that when you fight an enemy, you tend to adopt many of the characteristics of the enemy that you are fighting. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think this is a really important insight that gets lost when we talk about the Cold War. The United States, for those who were unknowingly operating with communists and underestimated them, but they were not themselves communists, right? First of all, I think that tendency to underestimate kind of verifies what Whittaker Chambers was saying about the revolutionary character of the New Deal. And some of the changes that went on to mobilize the United States for war. There was a cultural change. It made communists, not only for those who maybe pitied them from the first Red Scare when they really got slapped down, there was a change in the intelligentsia at the time. There was a change with liberals at the time where they couldn't recognize communists. So I think the revolutionary change and what it did, the disruption of the constitutional order, the cultural change, it made communism seem harmless. It made it seem that people regularly underestimated the Soviets, right? And I think that speaks to the cultural change in which the left was changed, whether they knew it or not. But on top of that, for those that there were, I mean, we can't deny it was not just that the Cold War was a bunch of right-wing Cold Warriors fighting communists. There were people that called themselves liberals and they detested communism, and they fought communism. They effectively fought communist infiltration. But again, when we're working with machinery of government, I think that there's a tendency, just like in warfare, is that you begin to adopt the characteristics and traits of your adversary. And I do believe that in the process of us fighting a Cold War over the course of decades, whether Americans wanted to or not, there was a change in which we started to resemble the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union in many ways started to resemble us. Arguably, it destroyed the Soviet Union. But I think that that's something that gets lost in our discussion here. And when it comes to intelligence agencies and when it comes to government agencies, we know that the New Deal was essentially opened up many, many new jobs to people that were, prospective government employees that tended to have a certain kind of background and pedigree. You had to be educated, you had to have certain skills, and these were usually acquired in more prestigious institutions. Well, that is fertile ground for people on the left, obviously, and FDR was very cognizant about stacking the administrative state with people that were sympathetic and understood the vision of the New Deal. It essentially, I've heard it described, I think it's accurate. The New Deal kind of installed a one-party state in the United States in many ways. But this also became fertile ground for communist infiltrators. And so there were card-carrying communists, and I'm not just saying people that belong to the party, because something that people need to understand is when you belong to the Communist Party of America, you belong to an organization that was owned and dictated by a hostile foreign power. Yeah. Joseph Stalin was intimately involved with the party's business. So this was also fertile recruiting ground for Soviet agents. So NKVD, and then later, they become the KGB. They are pulling and plucking people from the ranks of the party to work in the underground. And the communists knew the underground very well. The underground was where they had to go after Palmer's raids. And so they knew how to operate within the underground. And this is where they start to install this architecture of infiltration and subversion, not only into labor unions and other groups like that, but also into the US government. And this includes the precursor to what we have, the CIA. So the OSS, the Pentagon. Well, this was prior to the building of the Pentagon, but the DOD. So you have our defense, our War Department, the military. These communist subversives were targeting these different institutions as well. So they came in on a wave in the New Deal, hundreds, and maybe thousands, and then over the course of a decade, and then you have during the war, because during the 30s there's kind of a unity called the Popular Front, where at first CPUSA, the communists in America, were very hostile to Roosevelt. They thought that the New Deal was fascist. And this was something kind of, obviously, this is all marching orders from Stalin. Okay. They don't, every time that they're echoing their thoughts are not their own. And so whenever you hear Earl Browder from the Communist Party of America during the 30s speaking, he's basically speaking on behalf of Stalin. Okay. And so at the beginning, there's resistance to the New Deal. They don't like the New Deal. I think they see it as a competitor to what they want for the country. They accuse FDR of being a fascist. Well, as the world stage changes, then Stalin sees a lot of potential for an alliance between American interests and his own interests in trying to thwart Nazi Germany. And so during this time, CPUSA then changes, and they basically create a united front against fascists in America and abroad. Okay, and what that looks like is communists start to join other organizations which they're prohibited from joining by the party to try to take over the organizations, or at least spread their ideas and find alliances in traditional liberal institutions and outlets. And there's a big effort in media at the time. So newspapers, the New Republic, if it's still around, the New Republic, the Nation. These are magazines and newspapers which were on the left at the time and openly on the left, but there was a huge effort to defend communists from those different magazines, and that there were communists actually got involved with the operations of those newspapers and the editorials that were allowed to go through. I know the New Republic, I believe, was owned at one time by a Soviet agent, a paid Soviet agent, and the family that had owned that magazine had two or three within the immediate family, people that not only belonged to the CPUSA but were working with the Soviet underground at the time. And so this was a very intelligent effort to try to get the left, to unite the left around the principles, the shared interests of the Communist Party and of the Soviet Union. And it was very at the time. And so, a roundabout way to get to your question is that there was an infiltration effort, and that even after the Soviet Union and the United States found itself on opposite ends of the geopolitical spectrum, and there was a lot of enmity between the two, when Democrats and Republicans alike saw the danger and started to really force apart the Soviet Union from the United States, the influence of these forces was still there. There were still people that had been prominent activists during the Popular Front years who had been called themselves communists, and maybe they had changed their mind on some things. But the point I'm trying to make here is the effect is deeper than that, right? The culture is deeper than that.
Yeah.
And so where we're adopting tactics, there's also shared ideals. I think that's an important thing to focus on, is that the ideals that the New Deal espoused, the ideals, these have a lot more in common with the ideals that were purported by other world powers, including the Soviet Union, than they were to the constitutional order that preceded it.
Yes. Yeah. I think, one thing to go along with CJ's question, maybe to put some more detail or some more teeth on it, is you have this sort of left-wing narrative that the CIA and the OSS, which preceded it, was actually fascist, right? Allen Dulles was a fascist. You have Operation Paperclip, where they bring in all of the former members of the SS and things of that nature. But then, all right, that's the prevailing narrative, at least kind of in your Reddit history of the CIA. And at the same time, you look at the things the CIA actually did in the 50s and 60s and beyond, particularly in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. They were actively subverting the European colonial arrangements. So they're actively subverting the British Empire and the French Empire, and pursuing decolonization alongside of the Soviets in all of these places. And so they're pursuing like the same interests of the Soviets to rip these places away from Europe and get them for themselves, get them for the United States rather than for the Soviet Union. But the end result is the same. They tear apart these European empires. And so how much of that, in your opinion, is due to the fact that there were, at least fellow travelers among the people who ran the State Department, ran American foreign policy, ran espionage and intelligence operation coup d'etats and that sort of thing. How much communism was there, and was that driving, especially the anti-colonial stuff in the late 40s all the way into the 60s?
Great question. I mean, this is like the kind of fighting that Cold War historians do constantly. There was definitely, so Soviet infiltrators were in all sorts of departments. We know that now, right? And for people that are listening that are new to this, the Venona transcripts, you can go through the Venona files. They were declassified in 1995. There's a whole nother story on why they were declassified, what was happening, that we could get into another time. But I urge people to read those. That will at least give you an idea that communist infiltrators in high positions of government. Remember that the Soviet Union, see, this is the thing people don't understand. We get ourselves in a security mindset alone. It was not just making pinpoint decisions on a map. That was not what the communist infiltrators were, or the subversives. That was not the top priority of Moscow. Moscow wanted their agents to influence policy. That was the creme de la creme. That was that was the jewel that Stalin was going for, is policy, implementing policy. So he wasn't alone interested in just, getting a lieutenant or something in the army to start, sending plans of aircraft, which they did do, right? Or a naval that happened. That was important. But to somebody like Stalin, and the way that he viewed the conflict at the time and his goals, he wanted people in positions of authority that would be able to make and influence policy that had it could have a domestic factor alone. He very much prioritized those that could have both domestic and an international influence. And so, yes, there were individuals that had infiltrated the State Department, is a great example. That's actually what McCarthy had started with, was a list that he came out of, supposedly, of Soviet communists, card-carrying communists that were in the employ of the State Department at the time, because the State Department was known as being a problem. There were many allegations of communist infiltrators. Alger Hiss is the most visible that we know today, because he was found guilty of perjury. But yes, so there were people that had infiltrated the State Department, and they, the loss of China, that's a very fascinating thing to look into. Many of the allegations that McCarthy made about the loss of China, which people will focus on the allegations he made against George C. Marshall and show how ridiculous that would be. But I mean, there's a kernel of truth to every one of his allegations. And that's something I think people should maybe look into and focus on a little bit more, because like you mentioned, the United States did have a policy of decolonization. Now, whether that was and this is where I think we have to be careful, right? Because I think that the more important story, what we really want to know is, were these changes that happened, was this natural to us, or was this imported from abroad and really carried on by communist subversives and by KGB agents? I think that in the past, we've focused tremendously on the individuals, the KGB agents alone, and trying to measure the impact they had, decisions, or where they were. That's very interesting, fertile ground for exploration. I'm kind of beyond that now. My studies are more where our cultures aligned, where the interests aligned. Because like I said, the influence, these revolutionary changes affected all of us. They affected the United States in a unique way. And so when it came down to making policy, I'm not going to say that FDR was a secret communist. I can't find that. But that's not really like the interesting story. The interesting story is FDR represented a change, a sea change, that was the same sea change that transformed the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. Yeah. And that those goals were very much aligned until those two powers found themselves at loggerheads. And so, yes, I think Europe didn't understand. See, the war started as, we're going to go and protect Poland. Sadly enough, who gets left, carrying the bag and completely gets done dirty is Poland in the end. And so, like, we now know, like, the war might have started one way, but we know how it ended. And the thing is that the United States brought part of Europe, Western Europe, into its sphere of influence. And I think Europeans didn't quite understand that until the decolonization effort started, and America really was flexing into being an empire. And so, the United States, I think, sorry, I don't mean to be nebulous here, but I'll say that this is a tough issue because it's very complex, and because the United States government at this time is starting to become incomprehensible, right? We know it's incomprehensible today, but this is the beginnings of it being incomprehensible, right? Where the changes, the constitutional order has been replaced by really like rule by an anointed cast of players that their interests are not necessarily aligned with the people or with the consent of the governed. And this has international impact, right? Import. So this same thing is being tried abroad as well. Like this same effect is being felt abroad as well. And so the United States, there's not an American interest alone at play. And I think that people understand that if they look at the present as well. There are factions within this nebulous system that had been constructed during the New Deal. And these factions are competing with one another. They have similar goals. They have aligned interests, sometimes with foreign powers, right? But there are interests that compel these factions within government. And that's where the real game is being played. It's not necessarily always in the elections. It's not even between communists and the forces of democracy at this point. After the war. This is the rise of powerful political factions within this state that have a layer of secrecy that protects them, they're not impacted by elections like they would have been in the past. And so these factions of power, this Atlantic old guard, they're able to make decisions and have interests that sometimes will align with communists, and sometimes they will go, they'll be diametrically opposed to that of communists. But see, I think that's the underlying thing to focus on. And I know it's not as sexy. It would, a lot of people want to believe that our government was hijacked by a bunch of communists. And in many ways, certain ways it was, right? We did have communist infiltrators. We did have subversives. We had KGB agents at the highest levels of government. But the bigger story is that there was a sea change that transformed us and our allies that later became our enemies. And it was a similar revolutionary force. And I think that's the more important thing, because if you don't see it that way, then you'll be of the opinion of many on the right during the end of at the end of the Cold War. Hey, the Soviet Union's defeated. It's over.
Yeah. You see this today. I mean, you see this today with, I don't know if you subjected yourself to watching the presidential Republican primary, but you see this with like Mike Pence, uttering these Reaganite talking points 4 years later, as though we're fighting for freedom and we have this wonderful American democracy, and it's still trotted out this way. That it's still viewed, at least among wide portions of the population on the right, that the Soviet Union is gone, and so that threat to our way of life just disappeared and is gone. When the reality is that this political and cultural revolution that began much earlier in the middle of the 20th century continued to occur, continued to take place, and get worse and worse, and now it's reached a zenith. And it isn't, like you said, it isn't as simple as there were just communist agents pulling the strings on every single thing, and it was always the Soviets up to it. I mean, they had some involvement for sure. I mean, that's an incontrovertible fact. But it's its own particular kind of revolution that took place, its own particular kind of leftist revolution. CJ brought up the 1960s radicals, the Students for the Democratic Society and Weathermen and all the people that Barack Obama came from. And then, you end up having a person like Barack Obama becomes the president of the United States, and his 2 terms also had this drastic impact on our country. And we're still coming to grips with all the damage that was done over those 8 years. And so I guess the greater question is what would it take for people to begin to see it this way? I mean, because you have these people who have these talking points that are just totally oblivious to what has occurred. What does it take for people to see that we have had revolutionary change in our own country for the nearly the last century, and that the toothpaste is out of the tube, and there really is no going back to the old order without a tremendous amount of pain and conflict and fighting to get to that point. What's it going to take, Lafayette Lee?
Well, that's the golden question, and I think my project has been I delve into this stuff, and I mean we can always go into all the details, and that's all very interesting. I do that on the timeline sometimes, but I try to always bring it back to this.
Yeah.
Americans, by and large, even liberals, they want to see this continuity. Liberals will see this as a progression. This is just one giant, leap of progress from 1776 till now. We come along and we tinker with things and make things better, and it's progress. Conservatives, that's a harder pill to swallow because there's many things that they can't really stomach as being progress, right? They do see that the left has been ascendant, the left has been able to run the tables on them through the levers of power. And so that's a harder case to be made, but they still feel this connection to 1776. They still feel that has relevance and they're part of that, which I think is a good thing. Okay. And some on the right will fight me on this, and I'm fine with that. But there are fundamental questions. We talked about this before, but there are fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves, because if we're going to play along and say, okay, we are the same country that came, that was born in 1776. And we still talk about the Declaration. We still talk about the ethos of that document. We talk about the Constitution. We see the relevance to us today. And we still respect it. The governor of New Mexico can come out and say that she's going after people's guns, and there are sheriffs and other people that will stand up and say, no, that will not stand. See, that's where it's important. People on the right need to get this, is that clearly it has credence still. It does have credence. If nothing, in the hearts of the people. I think that is something you cannot just easily cast aside.
Yes.
But the fundamental question is the American Republic at its base level, at least the idea of it, is that the sovereignty lies in the hands of the people, that the consent of the governed is the cornerstone of our system of government. This has been purported for centuries, okay? We say this all the time. The forces of our democracy, say this constantly, whether they mean it or not. So I think that we need to be able to bring that up and take a harder look at it and say, okay, truly, is the consent of the governed still the cornerstone of this regime? Does the sovereignty lie in the hands of the people? We need to explore this, and we need to paint a picture for people, because there is real righteous indignation that exists when we point these things out, and that's valuable and it's important because it's truthful. People feel this because it's real. They don't feel like it's appropriate for the government to go to engage in proxy wars when they haven't been consulted by their representatives. When trillions of dollars are going out the door on a 20-year war, which has not really been placed back into the public sphere for debate. These are like fundamental questions. The idea of taxation without representation. Many of us on the right, because we see all the decay and the problems, we see this history and it disturbs us. It's easy just to laugh it off and say, well, how ridiculous would it be to even go back to 1776 and examine these things? But there's power there, because the legitimacy of our political class gets called into question when we bring these things up, because they have violated these things. And because the revolutionary changes of the 20th century upended that constitutional order. That needs to be addressed. This has been a century of radical change, that the American people are in a state of cognitive dissonance. And it has polluted our culture with so much chaos and division and discontent. And this is just a sign of these radical changes taking place where the people were never consulted, where the people have been just completely ran over by an anointed cast of leaders. And that's where I say, this is why we dig into these things. This is why it's important to interrogate the past, the narrative of the past. This is why it's important to take a second look at McCarthy. You might find that McCarthy was playing fast and loose at times with his facts. But he was fundamentally correct that our government had undergone this incredible change, that the issues of communist infiltration had never been addressed, had been denied and covered up by multiple administrations, that the people were never consulted in going to war until we were attacked, that these things had fundamental, long-lasting impact on American society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that terrorists from the New Left, you talked about the Weather Underground and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, why did they make such a seamless transition into academia?
Yeah.
Why does the child of one of these become a DA in San Francisco and drive the city into the ground and then find a position within weeks in Berkeley? Can people not see that there has been a real problem where this same ideology has infected our institutions, and at the base of this all comes down to those fundamental questions that were being sorted out in 1776: is what does a government that consults the people look like? Where sovereignty does not exist in an arbitrary power, what does that look like? I don't know if we can return to 1776. I'm not really saying that. What I'm saying is those questions still matter. And if we're going to get anywhere, I think we need to paint that picture, draw that contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. CJ, do you have any other questions? I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I guess my last one would be, like some people, you may disagree with this, but like Paul Gottfried, he would interpret what's happened over the latter half of the 20th century has been that the communist threat has largely subsided, and the fall of the Soviet Union helped to bring about the end of a communist threat, and it's been replaced by a new left that can't be described as communistic, but it can be equally subversive, and it's learned the lessons of the 20th century in a much more holistic way than like the liberal conservative consensus has. So I guess my question is, would you characterize the current left as also be a communistic threat, or is it like sort of a post-Marxist left, or does it even matter?
No, I think that's I think Paul Gottfried, I think, nails it really well. From my research and understanding, everything I've tried to wrap my arms around with this, I think he's right. This is not the left today is not a left that they have been influenced by these things. They are a post-Marxist left, because at the very base of this is the tactics that the new left has adopted and has developed are these have an antecedent, and we can see those throughout the Cold War. Okay, but at the same time, this is not a hard-boiled bunch of like communists. These people do not read books. They don't understand economics, and really Marxist economics were widely discredited following this. I mean, we have to remember that there are people, there are not a lot of Marxist economists left. You can't really go find them in the university, but you'll find them throughout the English department. I think that's important to look at, because this is a left that was, the communist threat it didn't just it was broken in many ways as we severed our ties with the Soviet Union. But the remnants evolved and changed. It's very similar to the idea. I absolutely agree with the idea that talking about socialism versus capitalism is a very 19th century discussion. Even if you even want to call it capitalism, which isn't even like a word. It's this is borrowed from Marxism, but we're not really talking about capitalism and socialism, Nikki Haley. Our economy has changed. We have transformed. This is history, right? We have to have a historical view here. We're like a managerial regime. That's what this is. And so it's it's not unlike these movements. It's not unlike the New Left. The New Left learned in the 1970s that if they engaged in bombing campaigns at the Capitol, they were going to, their leadership was going to get gutted and at least get a slap on the hand. Okay. And they could only go back and work in a university. It didn't really work. Okay? They underestimated their abilities. So what did they do? Well, they changed, right? So it became a lot more insipid. It became something much more subversive. They found their sanctuary in academia. Okay. And I think we are seeing the effects of their influence today, but it is not Marxist. No, it's not totally Marxist in nature. It has the same tactics, but they embrace massive corporations. They have these, they don't like billionaires because there's a resentment, because these people, if you think about it, the new left, the hand that feeds them they're getting donations, they're getting money through the state, they're getting grants. Like, this is how they survive. They are not productive people. Okay.
Yeah.
And so they hate billionaires because billionaires represent almost a competitor to that model, right? Billionaires are different. So that rhetoric often gets couched as like anti-capitalist. They're not really like that. They love tech companies. They love these things. That's what they use to exert control over everyone else. And so I think that is an important distinction, CJ. I think that's great. I think Paul Godfrey nailed it, is we can't get carried away as we notice this. We need to realize where it's evolved and changed and how it's changed. We can't really go back and say, there are KGB agents during this time and now completely ran by, closet communists. It's not like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all I have.
That's great. Well, I think that's also all the time that we have today. We're kind of under the gun for time, unfortunately, this week. But is there any work recently that you want to promote, Lafayette, that you want to let people know to check out?
Yeah, I mentioned it before, but I do have an Apocalypse Now analysis. I see it as niche, and so I'm drawing on some of that, but it will go into a little bit of this because I see a lot of relevance to some of the problems that our protagonist in Apocalypse Now is wrestling with and what we're wrestling with today. So I have another one coming out today. I'm a little bit late on that because we had some stuff going on over here, but that will be dropping today. So if anybody wants to check that out, that's over my Substack, which is ruins.substack.com.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I will definitely check that out because it's fascinating. I mean, just everything Vietnam War to me is always fascinating. I mean, we can do an episode just on the Vietnam War and talking about that conflict and what it means for American culture, and all of that. So that, I mean, and your take on it, this Nietzschean take, analysis of that film. I can't wait to read it. So I encourage everyone else to check that out as well. How about you, CJ? What have you got going on besides becoming a camper baron?
Camper baron. Well, I've been tweeting about Franco. So go read my tweets. I did a series on tweets on Franco and blasphemy, and Jenna Ellis right now is jumping into my mentions. She's very upset with me. And so, yeah, go check out Twitter. Nothing new on the Substack. So that's all from me.
All right. How about Chronicles? Are there any new episodes of Chronicles coming out?
It will be up to one tomorrow.
Okay. All right. We'll check that out too. I always get a lot out of those. And for me, I'm hoping, I always say this, I've been behind on posting new articles because I've been busy promoting a book. So I'm going on every podcast that I possibly can. And it's been great. I love going on podcasts. And it's been going great. The book is still selling really well. So tell your friends, if you've read it, tell your friends, go buy the book and read it and enjoy it. I think a lot of people are getting a lot out of it. So I've been really encouraged by that. But that's all for me for this week and for all of us. Thank you so much for watching this, listening to this, and stay dangerous. And we will see you next time.